Hi, I'm Rich Stotts, and I'm here to do lesson 3 in our series on change management for Maveneers, or change management for engineers. And today's lesson is going to be on knowing your audience. The information for this lecture is extracted from my book, Principled Organizations. And I just want to thank you for listening in. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can also subscribe and like the video if you want to. And again, this is third, and there's going to be many of these lectures afterwards, and I look forward to seeing you at those next lectures. Additionally, make comments and I will try to answer your questions, comments, and concern as I'm able. So what are the objectives for this lesson? It's really two. The first one is we want to understand the value of information. We want to understand what things make information more or less valuable, and in particular, the things that you have control over to allow you to get the maximum value of information to that decision maker. Second thing is, how do you tailor your message in such a way to convey the most information, the most actionable information to that decision maker? And it varies from person to person how you're going to portray that. We'll talk more about that as we get into the lecture. So first we'll talk about the value of information and what things make a piece of information more or less valuable. The bottom line is that there's millions of factors that go into what makes a piece of information valuable to a person. There's three broad categories of things that you probably have some control over, though. The first of that is latency or timeliness. What does that mean? That means all things being the same, ceteris paribus, as we'd say in the debate world. If you have the same detail, if you have the same accuracy, it's probably going to be more valuable if you can get that information to a decision maker more quickly. The next thing is context. Context means does the client have the facts they need to understand the information that you're presenting? And then finally, synergy, and that's other facts that support or extend the meaning of the information presented. An example would be, let me give you an example. So let's say I gave you three numbers, 10, 25, 50. In and of themselves, you would probably have no idea what those three pieces of information were. But now let me give you some context. Let me say this is the combination to a safe. And now you go, all right, very good. Now I'm going to give you some synergy. I'm going to say right, left, right. Now it's even more valuable. Another piece of synergistic information. If I say this is the combination to a safe filled with gold left over from the Civil War, it's out on public land and nobody else knows it's there besides me, and this is the location of the safe. Now that information's maybe worth $10 million to you, and my life has become worthless. Latency, timeliness means that you're getting it to somebody quickly. In that particular case, the latency of it is not very important. On the other hand, if I tell you the stock price of something, what it's going to be tomorrow, that has a 24-hour latency or less. If I tell you, the temperature outside, that has less latency, and you get the idea. Almost every piece of information has some kind of a decrease in its value over time. Key part, if you look at that little bottom box, if your client doesn't understand the information, it's your problem, not the client's. I have many times in many contexts over the years had people talk about briefing somebody and complaining that they didn't get it, and then making aspersions against the intelligence generally of the decision maker. No. If the client doesn't understand your briefing, doesn't understand your information, it's your issue and you need to fix it. But if you do the things we talk about in this briefing, in this lesson, then you're going to be a leg up on getting accurate information and understandable information to that client. So if you've listened to the first two lessons in this series, you know that I have emphasized the importance of measurable things when it comes to change management. And in particular, I use an acronym, AIR2, persistence, agility, information, and either range or redundancy, is the last R. And that's what we use as a metrics hierarchy to come up with measures. And in this particular case, we're going to use the information piece, the I in pair 2, and there's 5 aspects that we want to think about. Precision is relevant level of detail. Often more detail makes it more valuable, but sometimes you can go overboard and you can give too much detail. and then that either clouds the issue or makes it unintelligible or takes more time, etc. So you got to figure out what the right level of precision is. Quality talks about the accuracy of it. Then security is, are you protecting it? And how is it protected? Is it adequately protected? But is it not overprotected? Sometimes things can be made so difficult to get to that the people that need the information are either frustrated or barred from getting the information. Timeliness, we already spent some time on that, no pun intended. And then sharing is, where is it located? It is in a format that other people that need to use it can. So these are 5 aspects to it. You're not going for 100% in all of these areas. There are antagonistic forces in here. So for example, timeliness is kind of at odds with precision and quality often. Sometimes to get very precise information, it takes more time. Sometimes to verify things, it takes more time. The more time you spend doing that, the more time that drags on and the less timely the information is. Also, security and sharing have an antagonistic relationship. Sometimes the more secure you make things, the harder it is to share and vice versa. The idea is to go into this 5-dimensional space and figure out what the best point for your particular situation is for your particular client. I'm going to say that again. The goal is not to try to get to 100% in all of these 5 dimensions. The goal is to find out the sweet spot, the right place that works for your particular problem. So I want to understand context a little bit. Gestalt is the universe of sensory input, and it's the background that person lives in. Everybody's gestalt's a little bit different. I have a famous story. It's not very flattering towards me, but I was working at the time for an Undersecretary of Defense, which is a very, very important person, number 3 person in the Pentagon. So, huge level of influence, huge level of responsibility, very clever person, good-hearted person, loved working for them. I had been working on a really critical briefing for 6 months. I went in to brief the Undersecretary, and I'm a fan of Ed Tufte and his idea that you can put multiple dimensions of information on a single chart. And I took Ed Tufte's every word to heart, and I had produced this wonderful diagram with all different kinds of colors and shapes and width of things and orientation of one another. And there was about 6 dimensions contained in this one 2-dimensional chart. And I was quite proud of myself, and I slid it in front of the Undersecretary. And he looks down at it, and he looks at me, and he looks down at it, and he looks at me, and he says, "Hey, Doc, I'll bet you this is awesome because you do great work and you're a great guy, but I'm colorblind." Guess what? That was an abject failure on my part to understand the Undersecretary's gestalt. Don't make that same mistake, right? Try to figure out what kinds of things this person uses as inputs. We're going to talk a couple more examples later, but just generally, figure out a format that works for that particular person. Analogies and stories. Deeply embedded in our DNA is storytelling. As human beings, our heritage going back to the dawn of time, we absorb information better if it's told in story form. Think about fairy tales, or think about morality stories, or think about parables. Throughout history, people have capitalized on our storytelling to convey important facts and information. We're going to talk in a little bit about that. But the best thing to do is to kind of come up with some general analogies, come up with a story that explains the meaning of your information or your recommendations. And then we look for clues in the person's space. So, for example, if you look around the lady's office, the decision maker's office, and you see a bunch of football paraphernalia or football iconography, you would probably do well to use football analogies and football stories to make your points. Ma'am, we're at 1st and 10. Ma'am, this is going to be a Hail Mary. Ma'am, we're down by 21 points and it's the 4th quarter. Whatever the example is that allows you to effectively convey your message, do that. Now, what's a caveat? What's a warning here? If you know nothing about football, if you know anything about soccer, if you don't know anything about horse racing, you know anything about old movies, and you see those things in the person's office, steer back towards things that are more common. The worst thing that can happen is you think you're being clever and you give an analogy, and it absolutely is wrong. It doesn't fit within that space, and it's going to ruin your credibility, so don't do it. Just be careful. But if you can relate to things that clearly the person knows about or cares about or passionate about, you're going to have a better chance of getting your message across. Let's talk about context. So the same information can be presented in many different ways. Some, depending on the person, will be more effective than others. We're going to talk through an example here. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to start off with your analogy in an area that intersects the person's common sense and experience. And then you're going to work your way up, and then finally you're going to make a recommendation. And let me give you a couple examples. If I told you that an asteroid the size of Texas was going to impact on the East Coast of the United States, you know, because you've seen the movies or you've heard other factoids, you know that would be terrible. But I would present to you that most people in the audience, and probably me as well, I don't understand exactly the level of energy that would be released. So what we'll do is, and that might be true for the decision maker you're talking to too, but if you wanted to give this example, you would start off by saying, okay, have you ever dropped anything on your foot? Yeah. Okay, well now let's say that you went from that rock to a bowling ball. And they would go, ow, that would really hurt. And you'd say, yeah. That's one aspect of the energy involved in a collision, is the mass. It's how big, not how big, but how much mass it has, right? But there's another piece to this too. There's also the velocity. So think about a bullet. If you get hit by a bullet, it's a little thing, and if you dropped it on your foot, it wouldn't do anything at all. But moving it close to or just beyond the speed of sound, it has a tremendous amount of energy. It's going to do more damage. So do you see what we did in that example? You start off with the, hey, have you ever dropped something on your foot, which is experience and common sense. Then you moved up to a bowling ball. Okay, that makes sense. And then we got to the edge of that. We gave an equation, and then we talked about, hey, what would happen if this asteroid, moving at 28,000 kilometers per second with a mass of, 100 million bowling balls would strike. Boy, that would do a lot of damage. And that's not the example you're going to want to give, but you could give an example. Let's say it's the warehousing. You would start off with, well, a single person is going to go out and grab a single object from your warehouse. They're going to do this manually. It's going to take this amount of time. On average, this is how far they have to go. And then you do the multiplication and you say, okay, now let's say we did this part of the warehouse. It's going to have this kind of an impact. And you work your way through in a way that's understandable to the decision maker. Let's talk about personality type 2. So there's all kinds of ways of measuring personality. You got Myers-Briggs, you got Enneagrams, you've got all kinds of ways of measuring personalities. I have found over the years, over the last 4 decades plus in the work world, that this description of personalities is very effective in figuring out how you're going to brief information. By the by, we're not changing the information. The information is the same. It's how it's presented and what you're emphasizing, because different things are going to resonate with different people. If you're not comfortable with the information, then you shouldn't brief it. Also, by the by, if there's assumptions you're making, you need to be aware of what those assumptions are, and you need to figure out how them being true or false affects your results. So with that said, let's go into the 4 seminal personality types. First thing is we have beavers, and beavers are all about security, rules, and order. And the thing about beavers is that security is very important to them. So if you're going to brief somebody who's a beaver and you know that they're a beaver, the way you emphasize the importance of something is if you say, if you take no action, these are all the bad things that can happen. If you do this, many of these bad things are minimized. If it's true, again, it's got to be true. But the key thing is they're going to react from a visceral, emotional standpoint more to hearing that if they don't do it, things will be disrupted, security will be affected in a negative way, than they will be to hear about how bright and shiny something is. On the other hand, you've got lions. Lions are motivated by pride and accomplishment and recognition. And the way you brief something to a lion is you say, hey, if we do this, we're going to be the first people to do this. We're going to accomplish this thing that nobody's ever done before. And, the praises of this organization will be sung for 10,000 generations. On the other hand, you've got otters. Otters just want to have fun. They want things to be low stress. And you can imagine how you'd brief that, right? You'd say, this is going to be great. It's going to be exciting. We're going to come in here. We're going to do something new. Everybody's going to have a lot of fun. And at the end of the day, we're going to do something that nobody's ever... that's the otter approach. And then finally, you've got monkeys. Monkeys are motivated by schadenfreude. And monkeys, they want to see other people's pain. Hopefully you never have to brief a monkey. Now, nobody's pure when it comes to these things. What I talk about is it's a 3-scoop sundae. So, it could be 2 scoops of beaver, 1 scoop of lion. It could be 2 scoops of otter, 1 scoop of lion. It could be a scoop of otter and beaver and lion. And you have to figure out how to do your briefing based on what the personality of the person is. But if you think this is another one of these areas that no matter what you do in life, this is very useful information and just how to think about the world and approaching people. Now you want to make sure that when you're briefing the decision maker, when you're briefing the client, that you're actually answering the real problem, that you have a solution to the real problem and their organization. The first thing is it ought to fit within their organizational goals and objectives. What does that mean? First thing is you have to understand what their organizational goals and objectives are. Second thing is you need to know how to do a mapping between what you've found, what your findings are, and their organizational goals and objectives. If there's no connection, if they're orthogonal in an engineering terms of the dot product is 0 between what you're recommending and their organizational goals and objectives, you will get absolutely no traction. Absolutely key, and I'm measuring this first. Then you have to brief in a way that's emotionally resonant with the client. Guess what? That goes back to those 4 personality types. Finally, you've got to have a solution that's feasible, acceptable, and suitable. Feasible means that it will actually solve the problem. Acceptable means that it doesn't violate any guidance or laws or rules, are immutable, that can't be changed. And finally, suitable. Is it going to solve the problem, and is it going to work within the framework of the organization? So feasible, acceptable, suitable. Feasible, acceptable, suitable. Feasible, will it solve the problem? Acceptable, is it going to work within the mores and framework? Suitable, does it work given your resource constraints? In closing, if you can't communicate effectively with the client, no matter how clever, no matter how correct your recommendation is, the effort's doomed. Always think about context, synergy, and latency. You almost always have control over those things. The ancient Greeks talked about information and discussions as being divided into logic and rhetoric, that every argument had to have both logic and rhetoric. Logic means, is it data-driven? Does it make sense? Do things flow logically? Rhetoric is it in the right package from an emotional standpoint that people can hear it? We have the same thing, we just call it data and emotional content. But again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking the same data, the same facts, the same information, and putting it into a format that's going to resonate, in other words, going to be emotionally interactive in a positive way with the client. And again, data alone won't win the day. It has to be emotionally appealing. To misquote Sun Tzu, if you know yourself and you know your client, you'll be successful in 10,000 change managements. Thank you very much. Looking ahead, have a great day. Thank you all very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the next presentation.